convince the population to be very much compliant to rules. So things have gone much better.
Okay, well, we have some more people joining us, and hopefully more will come, but in the meantime, let's roll. Okay. I would like to welcome everyone to the research seminar of the Center for Institutional Studies at the HSU University in Moscow. We are very pleased to have as our speaker tonight, Professor Roberto Bonfatti from University of Padova in Italy. Roberto's degrees are from Bocconi University in Milan, and his master's and PhD are from LSE. He published extensively in good journals, and his fields are trade, history, and political economy. Unsurprisingly, his presentation tonight is on trade and history, trade disruption, industrialisation, in the setting sun of British colonial rule in India. So, Robert.
Thank you, Leonid, and thanks everyone for being here. It's a great pleasure. I've never been to Moscow, but even just being with you online is a pleasure. So Leonid is perfectly right. I have a paper on trade and history to present, and it's about India and the impact of colonial trade on it. So let me start by giving a bit of a broad motivation. It is a well-known fact that colonial empires favor trade between the colonies and the mother countries. They did this in a number of ways, by lowering tariffs, by creating common legal systems, a common language, by strengthening merchant networks between the different parts of the empire. So there's a lot of evidence that when an empire was built, over the decades, the different parts of this empire started to trade a lot more with each other than they would have presumably done if they had not been part of the same empire. Now, obviously, we as trade economists, at least, we believe that trade is good. So there will be good things about this. However, there's also a very critical view of colonial trade within empires. And this really focuses on the fact that because of comparative advantage, in this colonial exchange, the colonies always ended up specializing in primary products, while mother countries specialized in industry. And so one argument that critics have leveled for a very long time, ever since colonial times, is that this specialization in primary products essentially meant that colonies missed out on important industrialization opportunities. Now, again, as trade economists, we would counter-argue that the fact that you specialize in primary products per se is not bad. If that's what you can do best, then you should do it. But critiques of colonial trade typically have in mind a dynamic model of trade in which specializing in primary products is bad for your welfare in the long run, because industries producing primary products do not have the kind of growth externalities that you instead have within industry. So you specialize in the wrong things from the point of view of growth. So that's one argument against colonial trade, that it reduces industrialization chances for the colonies. The other one is that colonial trade also tied the colonies politically to the mother country. And the logic for this argument is that if a colony specializes in primary products, then its domestic political economy will come to be dominated by an elite that produces and exports primary products. And this elite are very friendly to the empire, because to them, the empire is big markets where they can sell their products. So the last thing on earth this colonial elite want is to break away from the empire. And so this empowerment of a local elite with strong ties to the empire, which sometimes are called the compradores, because they essentially help the empire intermediate the primary products that the mother country needs. According to this view, made it much harder for the colonies to break away from the empire. So these arguments have been made a long time ago and have been made for a long time, but to the best of our knowledge, they have never been tested formally using econometrics.
میتونی حرف خودم بدی تو کیفمه.
Yeah, there's some problem. Someone with a microphone on, I think.
Right.
I believe someone has the mic on and there was some background noise.
Please make sure that everyone's mics other than Roberto's are off.
Yeah, that's all right now. Please carry on, Roberto.
Okay, so we attempt to evaluate this argument empirically in the context of colonial India and using an exogenous shock to trade, which was World War I. So this is the shock to trade. On the left, I have Indian imports from Britain, and on the right, Indian exports to Britain. On the import side, it's quite clear what happened. India imported mostly manufacturers from Britain. It's this blue line, and those imports really dropped during World War I. And that's not surprising, given that during the war, Britain stopped producing for world markets and focused on producing for the war effort. On the export side, things are a bit more mixed. India exported primarily primary products to Britain, and during the war, some primary products boomed because they were in high demand by the war. For example, jute textiles were used to make bags for the trenches in Europe, but other less essential primary products collapsed, such as sugar, for example. So the aggregate effect was sort of no change. Okay, so World War I was a shock that essentially interrupted Indian imports of manufacturers, and it had a very heterogeneous effect on Indian exports of primary products. Now, to test the argument that colonial trade was bad for the Indian economy, we would ideally like to use a shock which interrupts colonial trade, so less imports, less exports, and then see what happens. In this case, we have less imports, but exports is a bit less clear, right? Some of them went down, but others actually went up. So we're going to focus mostly on the import side to investigate our hypothesis, but we're also going to use the export side in ways that you'll understand in a minute. So what we do more in detail in the paper is to exploit this temporary shock to try and infer what would have happened had India been less exposed to colonial trade. And as I said, we're going to distinguish between the shock to imports of manufacturers, and throughout the presentation, I'm going to call this the import shock. But it should be clear that it's the shock to imports of manufacturers, by far the most important import, and exports of industrially processed primary products. Because in the data, we also have, so we're going to study the effect of the trade shock on industrial employment in India. And some industrial employment was actually in sectors that processed primary products to then export them. Okay, so we're also going to exploit the export shock to some extent by looking at exports of industrially processed primary products. And I'm going to call this the export shock. Okay, so we're going to have two parts in this paper. So it's a very long paper, and I'll have to be very disciplined to try and finish on time. In the first part, we ask whether Indian districts that were more exposed to the World War I import shock became more industrialized, and if yes, whether this lasted or not. And then in the second part, we're going to use this this shock to instrument for industrialization levels. And then we're going to ask the question, did more industrialized Indian districts lend greater support to the anti-colonial movement? So is it true that by is it true that a greater level of industrialization would result in stronger anti-colonial feelings? Let me give you a preview of the results in case I can't get through. We find that an effect of the World War I import shock on industry. More affected districts moved to a higher level of industrial employment by 1921, and then they remained there throughout the colonial period. Now, one big worry we had was that this was not a persistent effect of the shock, but rather it was the effect of a persistent shock. So maybe British productivity in manufacturing suffered permanently because of World War I, and that is why we see that Indian industry benefited permanently, because it permanently faced less competition from British manufacturers. However, all the evidence we're able to gather suggests that that is not the case. We also look into channels, and we find evidence in support of learning effects. So this persistent effect of World War I was due to the Indians learning how to produce manufactures more efficiently. First, we find no effect of the export shock. So if there was a positive export shock in an industry processing primary products, then within that industry, we don't see a persistent effect. And we think that's evidence in support of learning, because it is normally thought that learning externalities are more important within manufacturing. So if we have manufacturing and primary products both shocked, and there's only persistent in manufacturing, then that's in support of learning. Then the other fact is that we find that the import shock made industry more ethnically Indian. Indian managers and factory owners benefited more from the shock than expats, and that also seems to suggest that the Indians had to learn how to be successful industrialists, and they managed to do so thanks to the interruption in competition from abroad during World War I. And then we also find evidence of a temporary rise in the number of accidents per workers, which, however, immediately after falls, as if Indian industry had needed some time to learn how to produce safely, but it eventually managed to do so. We also find evidence of learning effects by offering evidence against alternative theories, and I'll get into that when we get there. In the second part of the paper, we find that in more industrialized districts, members of the Indian National Congress, the main anti-colonial party, had strong anti-imperial feelings themselves in a survey we found for 1922, and also that the INC had a stronger electoral performance in the 1937 election, which is a key election because it's the first election which is won by the INC with a landslide. Okay, so that's what I'm gonna be talking about. Now I have an outline here. I'll quickly talk about the literature and historical background. I'll skim over a model we have, just to provide the main elements of it, and then I'll discuss our two empirical parts, the one on the trade shock and industrialization, and the one on industrialization and anti-colonial feelings. And in each of them, I'll first talk about the empirical approach, then the data, and finally results. Okay, so on the related literature, you may know a famous paper by Rebecca Juhat on the Napoleonic blockade and technology adoption in France. There's another paper by Kong Liu on World War I and China. We're very related to them. the main novelty, I think, is that we don't only look at economic effects of a temporary trade shock, but also political ones. We're connected to a large and very well-known literature on the economic legacy of colonialism. But that literature has mostly focused on the long-run implication of very extractive policies, such as the slave trade or the mita in Peru, or other extractive policies in colonial Africa. So obviously those policies had to do with colonial trade, right? You had to dig out the silver in Peru if you wanted to export it, and that's why you set up the mita, which exploited the locals. But we are not focusing on this kind of policies. We are focusing on apparently much more benign policies, such as keeping India open to international trade. So many people will tell you that's a good thing the colonizers did, but some people disagree, and we are looking into that disagreement to verify. Okay, there's some ongoing work on India, but let me also say that we relate to obviously the literature on trade shocks and manufacturing and political outcomes today, most notably the paper by David Autor on the China shock and industrialization or deindustrialization and politics in the USA. Okay, a bit of historical background. I'll just talk about the first 2 points. I hope to come back to the others later as I present the results. And very quickly, to say that British India was open to free trade in the late 19th century, early 20th century. By British decision, it was a laissez-faire economy, no tariffs or very low tariffs. And there's a very long-standing critique that this was responsible for her slow industrialization. Nehru, the first president of independent India, said that an incredible number of times, but not everyone agrees. There are some prominent historians that argue that the reason for slow industrialization in colonial India is to be found elsewhere, too rigid labor markets, for example, in the case of these historians here. Okay, so we're really trying to shed light on a historical debate on the origin of poor industrial performance in India. Okay, on the model, the role of so as you may have understood, what we're going to have is a traditional shift share type of regression, such as the one used by Autor et al. For the China shock in America. So we're going to attribute the trade shock to different districts, or we're going to calculate exposure of different districts to the trade shock by using their initial employment structure. Now, when we started doing this, we questioned ourselves in the following way. This regression that the Autor et al. Use comes out of a theoretical model that they have, and that model represents the modern USA, an economy with a current account deficit and a service sector where wages depend on specialization. And both assumptions, which are very, very realistic for modern USA, are crucial to they being able to write that regression equation. So obviously India in early 20th century was a very different economy. So we wondered, is it, does that empirical approach that everyone uses actually applies to a developing country? Can we write a model where we derive it for a developing country? And it turns out that we can. In fact, you can write a straightforward model that gives you exactly the same equation that Autor et al. Use for the modern USA. So that was quite surprising for us. And when we saw it, we decided to have the model in the paper because it took like a contribution in itself to show that that famous regression equation actually applies to very different types of countries. Just very, very, very briefly, in the model, there's a large number of regions, including the Indian districts, the UK, and other countries. Each region is endowed with LI units of labor. There's a freely traded agricultural numeraire, and J, industrial goods, which are differentiated by origins. So every region in the world produces a different variety of each industrial product. And these industrial products are divided into two sets. Some of them are merely processing primary products, while others are producing manufactures. Okay, and it's a simple returns to scale, a constant returns to scale model. We take 1 unit of labor to produce 1 unit of the numeraire everywhere, and beta ij units to produce industrial good J in region I. So this is a fairly general model in which every region will produce the agricultural good, and then will produce more or less of each industrial products depending on this productivity parameter here. What we then do is to make this general setting much more specific, so it suits our historical example. So we assume that trade costs between India and the UK are much lower than trade costs between India and third countries to capture the empire advantage. We assume that the UK is very productive in industry, in manufacturing, whereas India is very productive in processing primary products. And when you do that, the model describes what we see in the data. India will trade mostly, India specializes in primary products, produces mainly primary products, and trades mostly with the UK, selling primary products and buying imports of manufacturers and buying manufacturers. Okay, so you can find the equilibrium of this model. It's a very simple model, as you can guess. Then what you do in the model is to try and to identify the effect of an exogenous shock, World War I. So you look at how World War I will affect the initial equilibrium. And just to show you the results, this expression here tells you that, so Lij is total employment in India in sector J. Okay, so that's, for example, everyone employed in cotton textiles in India. When you have a hat and the number 17, it means that we're taking the percentage change. So we're asking, how does employment in India in this sector changes during the war, between 1913, before the war, and 1917. And what the model tells you is that it changes in the following way. If it's an industry processing primary products, then it increases when exports from India to the UK increase during the war. If it's a manufacturing sector, then it increases, employment in it increases when imports from the UK into India fall during the war. So this is for India as a whole and each sector. But another variable we're interested in is industrial employment in each district I. And this is what this is. So this is total industrial employment in district I. And again, you want to find the change in it during the war. And what you find is, so to find that, you basically have to take these sectoral changes that are common to the whole of India, and then assign them to each sector I using the initial employment share of sector I in each specific, in district I in each specific sector, okay? So if there's a big export shock in jute textiles, then district that were producing a lot of jute before the war will be very exposed to this shock. And the same you do for manufacturing. Now, those of you who know the papers by Otto et al. Will know that this equation here is exactly their equation for the impact of the China shock on industry in the US. Okay, with the exception perhaps that they don't really have an export shock because the China shock is only an import shock. So already we have something new in here. Okay, so this equation tells us there is a shock during World War I. How does this affect contemporary employment in India? So how did employment in industry change in India during the war? But we are interested in knowing, in studying persistent effects. So how did the war permanently affected Indian industry? And to find that, we need to go beyond the simple model and imagine that if there is a temporary increase in employment during the war, then that has some dynamic effects on productivities. So industries that expand during the war are able to become more productive, and hence even after the war, they continue to employ more people. Okay, so we add that dynamic to the model, and we get to these two equations here, which tell us the long run effect of the war. So these variables are now the percentage change in employment in a sector in India or within a district between 1913 and 1921. So that's already after the shock has finished. World War I is over. Okay, and we could also put a later year in the empirics. We look all the way to 1951 for persistent effects. So what you see is that the persistent effect of World War I on employment in India has very similar equations to the one we had before. The only difference is that you now have these parameter lambdas that captures exactly the dynamic effect of the shock on productivities. So if an increase in employment during the war has no effect on productivities, then all the lambdas are 0 and there's no long run effect of the war. But if employing more people during the war because you face less competition teaches you how to produce, you improve your productivity, then the lambdas will be positive, and there is a persistent effect. So we're going to estimate this equation here, and if we find positive coefficients, then we'll take that as a sign that the lambda, the effect on productivities during the war was positive. Okay, so now let me come to the first part of the paper, the empirical part of the paper, where we look at whether the World War I trade shock had or not a persistent effect on industrialization across districts and industries. So here I can go rather quick because these two regressions that you see here, although they have a slightly more annoying notation, they're really just the empirical counterpart of the two theoretical equations that I showed you earlier. So there's a district level regression and there's an industry level regression. The district level regression says that the share of population in district I that works in industry, so that's how industrialized the district is, and this is the change in that industrial employment share. So this tells you how more industrialized a district became between 1911 and 1921. Is going to depend on the export shock and the import shock. And the export shock is constructed by looking at the shock in each sector and then attributing it to the district using the initial employment share. And the same for the import shock. At the industry level, we have the same, except now I have these identity variables here to capture the fact that if industry J is manufacturing, then the shock that matters is the import shock. So this will vanish. If J instead is processing primary products, the shock that matters is the export shock. Okay. All right, very quickly on the data, to test our prediction, we collected a large data set on trade between the UK and India, the UK and other of its important destinations, and symmetrically India and other important trade partners of India. The second big block of data is a collection, and this all came from official publication of the time. because we needed data at the product level, which was not available in existing data sets. And the industry level, we also collected from the industrial censuses and other publication, industrial employment in 262 sectors across 235 Indian districts in 1911 and 1921 using the industrial censuses. But then using other publication, we were able to find total industrial employment across districts in all of these other years too. Okay. So there's quite a bit of work to do to match the trade data and the industry data, because they have industries in the two, they have different names. So you need to construct a crosswalk to match them. It's time consuming. But when you do that, you finally find 106 sectors that are traded. So they're either exporting or importing, or in a few cases, they're doing both. Okay. And you also have 49 non-traded sectors. So sectors that we were not able to relate to any international trade flows. And this is the sample that we're going to follow over time and we're going to use for our estimation. Okay, so main results. This is just to visualize things. This panel here colors in a darker color districts that were exposed to a bigger import shock. So they were specialized in sectors whose imports from Britain collapsed a lot during the war. The same is for the export shock here. So these are districts that were specialized in sectors that had a big increase in exports during the war. And then this is the change in industrial employment. So a darker color means a district that gained more during the war in terms of industrialization. And what I think is clear if you look at this picture for 10 seconds is that there's a visual correlation between this panel and this panel. So the import shock had an effect on industrialization, but much less so for this panel and this panel. And this pre-announces what we're going to find in the regressions, that only the import shock matters for industrialization. So here are the regressions. Don't have to wait long. So in column 1, we have the dependent variable, remember, is the change in industrial employment share between 1911 and 1921. And we regress that on how exposed the district was in import manufacturers and how exposed it was to the export of primary products, the shock to exports. And what you see is that it was only exposure to a bigger import shock that made a district grow faster. Negative coefficient means a bigger drop in imports results in a bigger increase in the industrial employment share. That result is very robust to adding the initial industrialization levels, a battery of pre-existing, predetermined district characteristics and province fixed effects. Then because the export shock doesn't seem to matter at all, we take it out, and as a baseline, we're going to use this column 4, which only has the import shock in it. Okay. World War I import shock had a positive effect on industrial employment share. Our baseline specification implies that the shock contributed around 29% of industrial growth in 1911-21. Okay, so one big worry that you may have, and we had when writing this, was what if the reason why we find an effect of the World War I trade shock that is still visible by 1921 is not that there was a persistent effect, but rather that in 1921, Britain was still in chaos, productivity was still low, and so they still could not afford to sell to India, and that's why the Indians continue to do well. So there's a number of things you can do to test for this. Let me just, to rule this out, let me just illustrate the last two. So the first thing we do is to show that the effect persists over time. So in this graph here, we are plotting the coefficient for our baseline well, actually, we want to do it for both sectors. So we're using this column 3 here. And we plot the coefficient for increasingly long periods of time. So the coefficient here, so the shock is still the same, but we're measuring the dependent variable as change between 1911 and 1926 now. Here between 1911 and 1936. So what you see is that the effect we have in our main set of results for 1921 remains constant throughout the 20s and 30s. Okay, so we think this is this suggests that it was not the shock that was persistent, because you would expect that by 1936 Britain had recovered from World War I, and so you shouldn't see this. The other thing we do is to so we also have a set of industry level regressions. So here we again have the import shock and the export shock, but this is at the industry level. So we look at changes in industrial employment in an industry in the whole of India, and how it relates to the trade shock suffered during the war. So when we do that, we get exactly the same result as before. The import shock matters, the export shock did not. But then what's interesting is that for industry level regression, we can also have industry fixed effects, because for a subset of industries, we know how much India imported in 3 different ports of India: Calcutta, Bombay, Mumbai, and Madras. So we can essentially construct 3 different shocks for each industry, depending on whether the industry was located closer to Calcutta, closer to Madras, or closer to Mumbai. So when you do that, you have a within industry variation in the shock. You can control for industry fixed effects, and to do so doesn't change the results. And we think this is evidence against the shock being persistent, because if there was a persistent change in British productivities, that should affect British exports to all 3 Indian ports in the same way. So any such effect should be absorbed by the industry fixed effects. And despite that, we still find a negative significant coefficient. Okay. All right. Let me. How am I doing with time? I have about 10 minutes. Is that correct?
Yes. Not more, please.
Okay.
Thanks.
Sure. Let me just quickly go over possible explanations for. So our finding that there was a persistent effect of World War I is consistent with the historical literature. Many historians have argued this. They simply haven't measured it econometrically, but they have argued it. Why was there that persistent effect? So the learning hypothesis is, as we said, the Indians just learned how to be more productive. They produced with less competition for a time, and that helped them learn how to be more productive. So we think that's supported by 3 pieces of evidence. So the first is that the export shock only had a temporary effect. So if we go back to our long run effects, at the bottom I have the effect of the export shock. And you see that there was actually an effect of the export shock during the war. So during the war, districts that faced a boom in demand due to the war, they did rather well. But then after the war, they went back to the original level. There was no persistence for industries processing primary products. The persistence was only for manufacturing, which to us is evidence for learning, because learning is normally thought to be particularly important within manufacturing. And then I think I'm going to skip this. When you look at exactly, I'll skip the details. When you look at exactly what type of additional employment the import shock created, you find that it led to the hiring of many more Indian managers as opposed to British expats manager. So there was no effect on expats manager. And also firm owners became more Indian. So again, we think this is evidence for learning because the Indians were lagging behind in terms of knowledge of how to run a modern firm, and they learned how to do that during the war. And then, as I said, we can show that accidents per worker first increased, but then declined by 1921 to be the same as before the war. So that also seems to be evidence in support of learning. Okay, I'll skip. We'll have time maybe to discuss alternative stories later. I'm sure you have alternative stories in mind, so maybe some of them I already have an answer to. Let me just go to the second part just to be able to cover the main results. So in the second part, we ask, the district will become more industrialized due to the World War I impulse shock, lend greater support to the anti-colonial movement, okay? And here I have a two-stage least square approach that is not grounded in the model. The model doesn't have politics in it, but it's just based on a reasonable econometric approach. So what we have is, in the second stage, we regress a measure of how anti-colonial a district is on in a year T on pre-World War I levels of industrialization, and then they increase between those levels and the year T. So if you put these two things together, they represent industrialization in year T. So we ask, how does your anti-colonial feelings depend on how industrialized you are? The reason why we specify this in this way is that we can instrument for that change, that increase in industrialization, using the import shock. So we're going to measure anti-colonial feelings in two ways. In 1922 and in 1937. These are two critical junctures for the anti-colonial movement. In 1922, the first big mass movement against the British failed, and there was an internal survey run by the Indian National Congress in which they asked members how in favor you are of fighting against the British, of immediate civil disobedience. So we know their answers, and we can construct a district level measure of how angry, how anti-colonial INC members were. And then 1937 was the year of the first Indian election, which the INC won by a landslide. And we're going to use the share of seats won by the INC in a constituency, which is a subset of a district, as a measure of support for anti-colonial movements. Okay, so let me skip on the data. This is a visualization of the survey results. Let me jump quick to the results so that I can then wrap up in time. So in the first, I'm only showing you the first stage, and this is for the 1922 survey. So we're asking the question, are districts more industrialized? Also those where INC members are more angry against the British, more in favor of rebellion. And we have different ways to measure that. There are different actions that members are asked about. But the most important for us is whether or not people are in favor of immediate civil disobedience, because the others are interesting, but the number of observations is very, very low. So as a result, our F-stat is very, very low. So we don't know how much we can trust these other columns here. But when we look at this, which is also the main question that was asked in this survey, where we have 90 districts, we find that a bigger increase in your industrial employment share leads you as a district to record more answers in favor of immediate civil disobedience. Okay, so that's a sign that greater industrialization levels made local INC politicians more in favor of fighting against the British. Now let me move forward to the 1937 election. Here, the different columns tells you the vote shares. So this is done at the constituency level, and each constituency receives the industrialization levels of the district it belongs to. Okay, so we have 324 constituencies now. So each column tells you the votes got by a different party. And what you find is that districts that industrialized faster between 13 and 36 as instrumented for using the World War I trade shock are also those that voted more for Congress and less for the Unionist Party, which was one of the main parties in support of the British Empire. So just to give you a sense of magnitude, we find that the World War I trade shock gave the INC an additional 7 seats, so 2.2% of the total, which is a small number, but we're happy that this is a small number because all the historical narrative of the INC says that what really mattered for INC success was support of the rural masses. So Indian industry was so tiny throughout the period that we would have been shocked to find a very big effect. So we think a small effect, but well-identified effect is very much consistent with the historical narrative. Okay, so let me, the 2 minutes I have left, let me just tell you about another placebo test we do. So one concern you may have is that maybe the World War I shock was somehow correlated with initial feelings against the empire. Unfortunately, we don't have very good ways of measure initial feelings against the empire. The best we could do is to go back to 1857, which was the last big revolt against Britain, the Indian mutinies of 1857, and construct a measure of district participation to the mutinies. And then we regress that directly on the import shock. So we do a reduced form analysis using the instrument, and we find no effect there. Whereas obviously the import shock has a reduced form effect on civil disobedience and the 1937 election. Okay, I'm happy to maybe come back to this later, but let me just conclude to be on time. We find that the interruption of colonial trade had a positive and persistent effect on Indian industry, possibly due to learning, and in turn, higher industrialization levels resulted in stronger anti-colonial feelings. We think the evidence is consistent with the negative view of colonial trade, but there are important caveats. Obviously, we haven't said anything about the welfare effect of all this. We haven't measured consumer surplus. So we can simply cannot say anything about that. It's unclear. India is not a random colony, was always a very successful manufacturer compared to other colonies. So maybe effects were particularly bad, colonial trade were particularly bad in India. And then there's a question about the long-run political effects of World War I. One thing we observe is that the businessmen who became industrialists thanks to World War I, they went on to support Congress, and they became very influential in designing the policies of independent India. And as we know, independent India became a very close economy, which grew fast for a time, but eventually was a disaster. So hyper-protectionist economy that really failed the purpose of growth. So one can make an argument, we think, that the World War I shock by leading to industrial growth also empowered some industrial interests that later were able to secure permanent protection. And that was actually very bad for the Indian economy. So one has to also consider this long-run political implications. Okay, so that was my time. So thank you for listening.
Fair enough. Thanks very much, Roberto. Thanks for being on time and for presenting a very elaborate and rich paper. We now have some time for discussion, Q&As, please. Who wants to ask questions or comment on this paper? Let me see if there is anything in chat. Okay, well, I don't see anything yet.
Well, Leonid, there's one question by Alexander.
Oh, please, yes, Alexander, go ahead.
Hi, Roberto.
Hi, Alex. How are you?
So basically the question I had, you kind of partly addressed it to your last slide. It's the question related to welfare. could be, I don't know whether it's possible, but it could be really interesting to try. I mean, the first exercise maybe is the standard one, is to look at the short run versus long run, the short run negative trade effect, and the short run potential positive effects due to industrialization and so on. But maybe even more interesting, of course, looks like it's very complicated, but to consider the counterfactual economy that could be like a counterfactual India that had not this particular trade shock. And to see, to compare basically sort of the steady state, there is some dynamics, of course, industrialization, growth, blah, 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 but we can try to compare two steady states in this case. And I don't know, maybe it's, as you mentioned, too complicated and there is no data for that. If it's possible, it would be very interesting to see, to look at this counterfactual India without this particular trade shock.
Yeah, I agree. There's also a lot of data for India, which suggests that something like that might be attempted. We haven't really tried, mainly because we have neither me nor Bjorn are very familiar working with quantitative models and simulating counterfactuals, but we agree that that would be awesome to do. So, you know, we're always happy. We're always looking for someone who might be interested in helping us doing that. So, if you know someone who could, we don't know. So this literature on trade shocks and industrialization has never attempted such something like that, as far as I know. So I think it'll be very interesting, even just to see if we're missing something with all these reduced form studies. We're missing something that should qualify our conclusions one way or another. So I think the first paper who manages to do that will be very successful, and yeah, I hope it will be us doing that. But yeah, we're not pursuing that right now because of this inexperience in that kind of models. But thanks for the point. It's absolutely well taken.
Okay, thanks for that. Anything further, please? Alexander, you're satisfied?
Yeah. Thanks.
Okay, good, thanks very much. Roberta, I'm not a historian and even less so a trade expert, but your paper eerily resembles in reverse the debates about opening up of the Russian economy in the early 1990s. Mm-hmm. Used to be a closed economy, of course, as you know, and fairly industrialized. But then back then there were arguments made that if you open up the economy, then Russia would be condemned to deindustrialization for obvious reasons, because in manufacturing industries would not be competitive. And it will degenerate, as it did, unfortunately, into specializing on natural resources. So the same pattern, although, as I said, applied in reverse. You open up trade, and as a result, industrialization is gone. But interestingly enough, there are some studies, and it's too bad that our colleague Timur Natkov is not here. He is a historian, unlike myself. And I know that he's working the paper where he studies the impact of the trade shocks on Russian regional economy in the early 1990s and how that affected political preferences of the regional population. In other words, if there is a region where the economy is specialized on manufacturing and industrial sector, then of course it goes into steep decline in the early 1990s, and as a result, all else equal, people are much more averse to market and democracy and whatnot, and are more nostalgic about the Soviet past, and they express these preferences in their voting, so on and so forth. So maybe it's a good idea. I will certainly let you more know about your paper, and the two of you will probably find something in common to talk about.
That will be very nice. It's really, this example is really the same mechanism in reverse.
Yeah, but put in reverse, right? In the case of India, trade stopped, and for whatever reasons, and as a result, you observe industrialization with some long-lasting political impacts, among other things. And in Russia, trade begins, and lo and behold, similar effects. So might be interesting comparison. Okay, good. So I'll make sure Timur knows about that. He'll probably contact you. Anyone else, please?
Thanks.
Let's see if there is. If there,
yes,
Bernardo?
I guess my question might be a bit in the lines of Alexander. So I'm wondering whether there are some, some similar, well, or relatively similar countries to India that maybe were not so affected, like that their mother country was not so affected by World War I, and like I'm interested to see like how would be the path of their countries. Like, I don't know if there's any data or if you can think of any.
So you're thinking of countries who were not affected by World War I for some reason, and you want to see if if their industry benefited less as a consequence.
Yeah, like to see like I don't know, like how is the path of like a similar country but who suffer like a lesser shock or no shock, but in the same context of India. But I don't know if there is such country.
Yeah, so that would be
a pretty wide war, of course.
That would be interesting. So I know from historical work on this that, or at least it has been argued by historical work that many other countries around the world benefited from the World War I trade shock. Well, in fact, there's the paper by Kong Liu that I managed finds similar effects to our own for China, but the same has been argued for Latin American countries. And interestingly, a similar effect has also been argued happened for World War II. So I've read accounts of decolonization which argued that one factor that pushed for decolonization was that during the Depression and World War II, many colonies developed their own industrial base, and these new industrialists, they were always pushing for decolonization because for them the empire was a terrible institution to be in. So I think there are many cases of countries that experience something similar to India. I can't think of one that was not affected by some reason. So one would be one would be the USA. So we actually use in one of our specification to try and measure the change in British productivity between 1911 and 21, which is a concern for us because it could be that has a persistent effect on India. We use trade flows between Britain and the USA to estimate the change in British productivity on the logic that the USA was not so much affected by the trade shock because it continued to trade a lot with Britain throughout. But the problem is the USA is not really the kind of economy where you would expect to have the infant industry argument working because it was as advanced as Britain or even more advanced than Britain back then. So it's not a good example of what you have in mind. But I'll think about that. It would be nice to have somewhere an example of a country that for some reason did not benefit.
Okay. In fact, I was curious about what happened during the Second World War, where there was a much harder reason for the interruption of trade between India and the UK. Mm-hmm. And did you ever try to explore it more extensively, or? No,
we haven't. But I've heard a lot about India, and I think something very similar to World War II happened. To World War I happened, basically.
Okay, so déjà vu.
And that's why. So we used to have a very long. In the data, you also observe that districts that were hit hardest by the World War I import shock, still nowadays, so 2011, they're still more industrialized than the others. So there's a long-run persistent effect. But then we took it out of the paper because precisely we believe that there were other shocks that happened later, such as World War II, that certainly very correlated with World War I, and we didn't want to go into.
Indeed. Okay, thanks. Anything further, please? Questions, comments on the paper? I see none. So, Roberto, thanks very much for presenting at our seminar.
Thank you very much.
As I said, good luck with this paper, and hopefully we'll stay in touch, and you'll have a chance to visit Moscow offline as well before too long. Bye-bye.
That would be
Take
great.
care.
Thank you again for having me.
So, Bernardo, next time we meet, please remind us what.
So we meet in 2 weeks. So
2 weeks time. Okay.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Yeah. Bye-bye. So yeah, the 28th of October we will have a. Sorry, not in the 11th of November we will have Tuomas Pekarinen from BAT Institute, and he will be presenting the making of social democracy, the economic and electoral consequences of Norway's 1936 folk school reform. So,
okay.
Yeah, 2 weeks time, same place. Same
we'll
time.
see each other again in 2 weeks time.
Yeah. So thanks
all the
everyone
very best
for joining.
in the meantime.
And,
До свидания. See you later.